this afternoon. I know that we're decimated a bit with the travel and the wintry weather, but nevertheless, I hope that you'll be pleased to attend this session, special session of Language and Communication Services, where students of BA English will quiz one of their prized authors, who I'm happy to have down, Ian McGuire from Manchester. And I should just tell you that on the module where we read The North Water, Ian's celebrated novel, it's a novel on contemporary literature, and we read work from the last 18 months, no longer than that. And so it isn't that long ago that I read Ian's novel, and I must admit, it's sticking my neck out, that it's the best novel of its kind that I have read forever, and certainly the best since Zola hung his pen and stopped writing. And I just had to introduce other people to this. And of course, whenever you teach a class on a novel like this, you find out so much more from sharing it with your students. So actually, some of the things that have come up in our discussions of this novel, hopefully we will replay them, but with this difference, in this instance we will get some answers which may not be definitive, but nevertheless that they will at least scratch an itch that we've had for some time. Okay, so we're slightly reduced in our numbers, but I would like you to give, first of all, a warm welcome to Ian for coming down, and then we'll commence questions. Okay, so we'll have we've got a round of things that we've raised in our classes, and then we'll open up to the floor. So if you've got yours, then hold your horses, and hopefully it'll be different from the questions that we ask. It's me. My questions. Sorry. Oh yes, I had this question, and I thought somebody else had asked this actually. But before this novel was published, you couldn't have imagined a more unfashionable novel to be published. Of its kind, you know, there haven't been many naturalist novels published to great acclaim in recent years, certainly in the United Kingdom. And I wondered whether you also took an American model in work of grossly unfashionable writers such as Dreiser, Crane, Norris, and so on.
Yeah, I didn't. I think you're probably right about it being unfashionable, but fortunately, that didn't strike me before I started writing it. I think it might put me off if I realised it was terribly unfashionable. So I didn't think of fashionable being fashionable or unfashionable. I suppose I thought, you know, I'm sure I will at some point tell the sort of story, the whole story of how it came about. But when I got the idea for the novel, it struck me as, I suppose it first struck me as a kind of thriller or a crime novel. That, you know, I thought about the idea of a murderer on a whaling ship. When I got that idea, I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea, but it's not for me. That's a genre novel. It's someone who wants to write that kind of novel. And then, for various reasons, the idea kind of grew on me, and I started writing the novel. So I suppose partly its unfashionability is in the context of kind of literary fiction. And I wasn't entirely sure as I started writing about it that I was writing literary fiction. I thought maybe this is going to turn out to be a kind of full-blown thriller. And it didn't. I mean, it turned out to be, I suppose, these categories are always sort of blurry, aren't they? But I suppose it's a kind of a literary thriller or something, for want of a better term. So I think that's why the kind of unfashionability of it didn't strike me when I didn't put me off or scare me, because I was thinking maybe it's not a kind of piece of literary fiction anyway. And I don't think anyone has asked me about it in terms of it being a naturalist novel before either. Although that's interesting to put it in that context, and I can see that makes sense. I mean, I've taught at Manchester University for a long time, and I teach in creative writing now, but I started teaching American studies about 20 years ago. And one of the classes I used to teach was naturalist fiction. So I used to teach, the grossly unfashionable Crane and Dreiser and Norris. I think Frank Norris is a fantastic novelist, but very little known or read. So I think that stuff is in my unconscious, is in my mind, and so I think I definitely wasn't. And Jack London, a lot of people have said, is Jack London a big influence? I was in France. I did a literary festival in France. I think Jack London is very big in France, and they were all asking a lot about Jack London. I've read a lot of London. I've taught Jack London, but he definitely wasn't at the front of my mind when I was writing The North Water. But he was probably at the back of my mind. One of the things, I suppose, when you write a novel and publish a novel, you don't really know how it's going to be read and how it's going to be interpreted, what people are going to make of it. And one thing that I was surprised but not sort of upset about at all was right from the beginning, people read The North Water in terms of its influences and in terms of the sense of it's a novel in which lots of other novels are kind of beneath the surface, which I like and I think is true. But I think I realised only in hindsight I realised, well, that's probably because I've spent almost all my adult life reading and teaching these books, and so whether I like it or not, when I kind of reach for a sentence or reach for a character, that's sort of knowledge of all this history, particularly history of American writing is sort of there, whether I know it or not. So I think those influences were definitely not conscious, but I think they're absolutely unconscious. And as you were saying, what the writer knows about his work is not definitive by any means. Partly because the writer always has their own axe to grind, and you want people to read it in a certain way and not in another way. But more importantly, I think because so much of what you do is unconscious, that when you're writing, you're just trying to. You're trying to sort of make it work, trying to find something which feels right and interesting. And if you find something that's right and interesting, you don't sort of ponder why is it right or interesting, or why have I come up with this idea rather than that idea. You just get on with it and do the next thing. So it's your unconscious that throws up all this stuff, really. So you know a certain amount about the novel. You kind of remember what it was like to write certain bits, but I don't think you can say for sure where it all comes from.
Okay, well, that gives us license, because I think that we will explore naturalism a little bit more in some of the questions.
It's fine.
Sarah, you next?
So you stated in other interviews that you didn't have many sources about 19th century whaling. So what then did your research about whaling entail? Did you use a lot of non-fiction or fiction? And building on from that, to what extent did Melville and Hemingway influence your writing?
Okay. Well, the first part of that. Yes, I think people ask me they asked about research for the novel. That's a common thing to ask about. And one thing they ask about, which is, I'll get to the specific question, but I didn't go to Baffin Bay to look around, where partly because it costs a lot of money to get there. It's a very difficult place to get to, but also because of climate change, the landscape is very, very different. So I realised it would actually be quite confusing, because the novel is, most of the voyage is in the summer months. They went there in the summer months, but in the 19th century, in the summer months, there was a lot of ice, whereas now there's no ice at all. That's one of the reasons I didn't go there. So I relied on reading and photographs, and the reason just isn't much of a literature on Arctic whaling. There's maybe I've got a shelf or half a shelf, maybe 10 or 12 books. That's it really on the kind of, and half of those or more than half of those are things written at the time. So there's a kind of Bible of Greenland whaling is a 2-volume work by a man named William Scoresby, who was a whaling captain, who wrote a kind of very thorough account of the industry and what it was like and the mechanics of doing it. So that was a huge boon, really. All the whaling, all the details of how to kill a whale and also how to chop up the whale comes from that book, really. And then there were a number of other autobiographical stuff, usually written by ship surgeons, because the ship surgeon was the most educated man on board, and also they usually had quite a lot of spare time, so they would sort of look around, make observations, sort of look at the wildlife, and often write diaries. So that was a big resource. But in terms of, there's very few kind of contemporary historians who've taken any interest in Arctic whaling at all. The other thing, I mean, most books about the Arctic in the 19th century are about the Franklin expedition. I don't know if have you heard of that? Or Franklin expedition was a famous expedition in the mid-19th century to find the Northwest Passage. And it was Sir John Franklin, who was a famous kind of naval hero, went with I think two or three ships and disappeared. And it was they didn't know what happened. They obviously all died. But it went on for, his widow sort of encouraged the Navy and encouraged people to send expeditions to try and find Franklin. So there's this big mystery about what had happened to Franklin. So there's a huge library of Franklin stuff, and I did draw on that a little bit, just for the sense of the landscape and the sense of what it was like to be on a ship. But there's a big difference between being on a whaler and being on a naval ship, or being on a ship that was interested in exploration. So yeah, there isn't that much on Arctic whaling. Hemingway and who was the other one? Melville. Melville, yeah. Well, Melville is a huge influence. I mean, I may as well tell the story of how the novel came about, because that goes back to Melville. So I wrote, this is my second novel. So I wrote a first novel about 10 years ago, which was completely different. It was a comedy set in a university, so it was a campus novel, which was quite a good novel, but it was completely, commercial failure. No one, I mean, it was nicely reviewed, but it didn't really go anywhere, as often happens with first novels. And then I spent a few years just floundering really after that in terms of writing, not knowing what I wanted to write about and struggling and not being able to find a good subject. I would send things to my agent, and she would kind of tut and say, it doesn't sound very good, think of something else. She would say, write something bigger. And I was like, what does that mean, write something bigger? And then I thought, okay, I'll try and write something bigger. So my first idea of writing something bigger was to write a novel about Herman Melville, about his life, so a kind of a biographical novel about Melville, based on, there's a really good novel, or a novel that I really like, by the Irish novelist Colm Tóibín, about Henry James, called The Master. I don't know, that must be published maybe 15 years ago now. And I always thought, I could write a novel a bit like that, because I've got this academic background, so I thought I could use that and write a kind of biographical novel about a great writer. And Melville seemed like a good writer, because he had a sort of strange and interesting life. Not least because he was a great failure as a writer in his lifetime. So now he's seen as an icon, but at the time, Moby Dick was a kind of disaster, and then books have followed her even more. So I thought that would be a good subject. So I started trying to write that novel, and I got to the whaling section. I did research on whaling. It's a different kind of whaling that he was involved in, but I stumbled across this book written by Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes author, about his summer. He was a medical student in Edinburgh, and he spent a summer as a ship's surgeon on an Arctic whaling ship. So that's where I got the idea of a murder story set on a whaling ship. So when I said that was that was the kind of inkling of that idea. And that was the moment where I thought, well, that's a good idea for someone else. That's a good idea for a crime novelist or something like that, not for me. But I couldn't make my Melville novel work. I think partly because I realised that it's really hard. I mean, Colm Tóibín did a fantastic job, but real lives don't come in a very sort of satisfying, dramatic form. So I couldn't make his life sort of interesting enough in the way I wanted it to be. So in the end, I kind of abandoned that. Well, also, and then the final sort of nail in the coffin of that novel was that someone else published a novel about Herman Melville, a novelist called Jay Perini, I think. So that kind of just, I was struggling anyway, and then when someone else publishes a novel on the same theme, so I just kind of, I gave up and I started writing The North Water. But yeah, Melville was always a huge, I mean, I think writing about whaling, you have to have Melville in the back of your mind. I mean, there are parts of the novel which are stolen from Moby Dick. There's the bit where they kill the sharks. The sharks come to eat the whale, the corpse of the whale, where they find that rotten whale, and they start stabbing the shark, and the sharks start eating themselves, and eating their own entrails. So that's from Moby Dick. So shamelessly stolen. And there's a less of an obvious steal, but early on in the novel, where before he gets on board the ship, where he encounters the guy without any legs who kind of warns him. There's a chapter early on in Moby Dick called The Prophet, where he basically stumbles into someone saying, "Don't go with Captain Ahab; it'll all end in disaster." So that's kind of structurally, I thought that's a nice. It just kind of foreshadows it, and it just sort of intensifies the sense that getting on board the ship is not a good idea. So I stole that from Melville. But yeah, people have asked me a lot about the relationship between North Water and Moby Dick and Melville, and I think more I think about it. I mean, it's indebted to Melville, but it's very, very different. It's a very, very different novel from Moby Dick. And Moby Dick is a strange novel in lots of ways, and it's really a philosophical novel. This big thing which tries to include everything and tries to tell you stuff about the world. And it really uses whaling as a metaphor, as a fund of metaphors to describe sort of philosophical ideas and meanings. Whereas the North Water it sort of flips that around, really. I mean, it's about sort of material stuff and the body and physical reality rather than philosophizing and so on. So in a sense, it's indebted to Melville, but it's a kind of revision of Melville in that sense. Hemingway. Yeah, Hemingway. I mean, the one writer who I was conscious of, one sort of contemporary writer who I was conscious of borrowing from in this novel was not Hemingway, but Cormac McCarthy. I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. So Cormac McCarthy is great. I mean, I guess he's old now. He must be in his 70s or almost 80 now. But great American novelist who was. I mean, his great influence is Faulkner. But I read McCarthy very carefully while I was writing the book, or before I was writing the book, because I thought, okay, it's kind of a thriller, but it's a literary fiction. Who does that in an interesting way? And McCarthy was the name that cropped up. So I sort of went back to McCarthy and I sort of said, how does he do it? How does he make it work? And I think one thing that I sort of saw in McCarthy is there's Faulkner and there's Hemingway. And he moves from one to the other. You can almost see it page by page, that you'll have a paragraph. I mean, McCarthy is very well known for the kind of sometimes slightly absurd richness of his language, and he uses a very obscure vocabulary. So there's that which comes from Faulkner, but then there's Hemingway comes in, and there's this very pared down, bang, 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 bang dialogue. So that I kind of took that from McCarthy. So there are passages in The North Water which are very pared down, which are very Hemingway-like, and which I think the way it works in McCarthy is the kind of balance that you have paragraphs which are very kind of rich, and the prose and the sentences are quite elaborate, and then you have sentences which are just about telling you how stuff happens. And I mean, hopefully that works as a kind of, you have different flavors, different sounds, different registers which combine. Thank you.
Can you offer some comments on the denouement of your novel? Why did you choose to do it?
Yes. So the ending. Endings are very difficult. At least I find endings very difficult. because you kind of have some obligation to tie everything up, even if you don't tie everything up in a kind of Dickensian way where they all get married and you know exactly what happens. You have to send, you set all this stuff going, and you have to find some way of sort of elegantly or reasonably elegantly bringing it to a conclusion. So I always find endings very difficult. I had the ending that the ending of the North Water was not the ending that I had when it was bought, when the novel was sold to Scribner in the UK and Henry Holt in the US. It had a different ending. And then what happens is you sell the novel, and then the editors sort of have a good read through it again and give you some suggestions. And so both the American editor and the UK editor, their only suggestions were to do with the ending, saying they didn't quite understand. They had questions, they weren't sure why this happened or what that happened. And they thought I could just tweak it or alter it a little bit. But I just, looking over their comments and thinking about them, I felt that the first ending was just too convoluted. So in the first ending, I won't go through all the details, but in the first ending, Sumner ends the novel not ever understanding what happened. So he never understands that Baxter has organised all this. He never understands that it was an insurance scam. Drax ends up being murdered, but he doesn't know. He's just kind of clueless, and he leaves the novel in this sense of uncertainty. So we, the reader, knows what happens, but he never figures it out. And I think that it ended up being confusing for the reader, or at least for these two readers. So I thought, okay, maybe I need to change it. So I came up with this completely different ending, which I think is, in some sense, a simpler ending and a clearer ending. Although maybe I sacrificed a little bit of kind of nuance as well. I think the ending now, in the sense, I think the ending now is you have the good guy Sumner and you have the bad guy Drax, and they come together, and one of them kills the other, and that's kind of, there's a kind of mythological sort of power to that. And there's this kind of simplicity. There's no way the reader can ever be confused about. Although it is kind of intricate, the kind of the way they come together. But then the very ending, the final chapter in Germany, when he goes to Berlin, the zoo. That was, I don't know quite. I suppose the idea behind that is Sumner as a character has always wanted to escape from his past. Really, he's a character who is haunted by what's happened to him in India and previously, and he can't escape from his past. So he has to escape from his past. So in the end, he does escape from his past. He kind of reinvents himself. He leaves the country, and he kind of, you see him very briefly in Berlin, dressed differently. He's a different person. You kind of assume that he's reinvented himself. But then I suppose the note that I wanted to end on is, well, what does that really mean? What happens if you reinvent yourself? If you cast off your past, who are you? There's kind of, it's easy enough to think if I just get rid of all this stuff which is bogging me down, everything will be great. But actually, there's just this new set of questions about who he is, what will happen to him, and a kind of loneliness, I suppose, isn't it, that the novel ends on. And then the idea of ending at the zoo was just a kind of little, it felt like a little gift that I just kind of, I thought I knew he needs to get to Europe, he needs to escape. I don't think I didn't know which city he was going to escape to. And then he went to Middlesbrough, so the easy place to get to Middlesbrough is Hamburg. So we'd go to Hamburg. We're not going to stay in Hamburg because that's an obvious place to look for him if he escapes. So maybe you go to Berlin. Oh, there's a zoo in Berlin. Maybe they had a polar bear there. So kind of these things. And I just feel kind of lucky that image popped up in my mind because I like it. I like that as a way of ending. And it's just a kind of nice, neat way of tying it up. But again, it's people. I don't know what people who've read it thought about the bear that crops up, because people have said to me, "Oh, is it the same bear we let go?" which never occurred to me before people said that to me. And they were like, people didn't believe me, they never had that idea. But in some sense, it doesn't matter. I suppose I can talk about polar bears. Maybe there's a question about them, but I can talk about those polar bear in the novel. But in the sense that a bear is that they're all the same bear in some sense. They all represent the same thing. So when he encounters the bear, it's kind of he's encountering all the bears that he's encountered in the story.
Yeah. When does the human become a non-human animal?
Oh yeah, well okay, this takes us to the polar bears. Yeah, I mean that's the difference between human. Well, what's it mean to be human, and where do you draw the boundaries between human and animal is definitely something that the novel is very interested in sort of pondering and playing around with. I suppose it happens. I mean, Drax. My way of kind of getting into Drax and my whole concept of Drax was he is an animal, really. He's human, but he's also really an animal. He thinks like an animal, he behaves like an animal, you know. Primarily because he acts through instinct and he has no sense of remorse or guilt. He doesn't worry about the past, he doesn't think about the future. He lives in the present, in this kind of present moment of just looking around and doing what seems the right thing to do next. That was really, I mean, it's a very helpful kind of way of thinking about the character because it just everything he did was powered by that sense of him being like an animal. But then again, I thought, you know, in some sense that's slightly unkind to animals to associate them with this kind of psychopathic, sort of paedophilic murderer, because animals are, you know, not quite as bad as that. So in some sense, the polar bear came in as a way of sort of balancing out or complicating our sense of animality as well, because the polar bear represents, I'm not quite sure what the polar bear represents, but it represents a kind of different set of ideas about what it means to be an animal. I mean, one of the things, when I did the research on kind of Inuit Eskimo culture for that section of the novel, of course the Inuits had various spiritual, religious attitudes towards polar bears and towards the other animals around them, which is quite normal for that kind of culture, I suppose. And when I first read, you know, they thought of polar bears as having a great sort of spiritual power and importance in their mythology. I just thought, okay, well, yeah, normal sort of superstition. But then at a certain point I was writing it, that sort of seemed to me to begin to make sense. I thought, oh yeah, I could see why, not just rationally, but kind of emotionally, why you would give an animal that kind of spiritual significance. It would have a kind of power. I suppose because two reasons. First, because animals are living, they're conscious, yet they're not human. So we move around, they move around us, and they are different kinds of creatures. And we usually, I mean, maybe in a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition, we take that as being a sign of their inferiority. You know, we're superior to them, they're inferior to us. But I don't think there's any reason to think that. There's no logical reason not to imagine that actually they're seeing the world in a way which is kind of superior to us, or certainly it's different anyway. So that struck me, and then also I think the idea that because each polar bear is not individual, that polar bears are kind of, they act as, they're a kind of species, so they're kind of immortal in some sense. You can kill one polar bear, but the polar bear keeps on going. So I began to think of animals as having those kind of qualities as well. So I was very interested in how you draw the line between animality and humanness, and what it means to draw that line. I mean, there's what kind of violence we think is acceptable and what kind of violence we think of as inhuman. So the kind of violence that Drax commits, killing people, raping people, obviously that marks him as inhuman, as animalistic. But other kinds of violence, like the violence of colonialism or the violence of whaling itself, is acceptable and allowable. So I think, you know, like most novels, I don't come to any firm conclusions, but I think I wanted to sort of raise the question of how firm that line is. Do we like to think there's a kind of firm line between humans and animals, but it's actually, if you think about it, it's a lot less firm than you might like it to be in some sense.
Would there have been any room for female characters, and does this novel make any comments on issues to do with gender?
Yeah, my wife jokes that it's a feminist novel because it tells you how badly men behave when they're on their own. Which is a joke, but there's a certain truth to it as well. I mean, it's a joke because it's not, I don't think it could ever describe it as a feminist novel, but I suppose if you wanted to think of it in gender terms, it would be about masculinity and maleness and does this tell us something about manliness and ideas of manliness and the way men behave? I mean, there are no women in the novel, only they make a very fleeting appearance, but there's also lots of other things that are not in the novel as well. I think it's often interesting to think about a story or a novel in terms of what's missing as well as what's there, a kind of negative space. So there's no women in the novel, but also there's no, I mean, it's a novel which has no, a lot of the things you stereotypically associate with women, like love, intimacy, kind of closeness, as kind of missing as well. So there is that sense of, there's kind of it's a hard, cruel kind of world that they live in. And yeah, I suppose, would that be different if there were women present? I'm not sure. Wary of sort of saying women are, just by their presence, make things nicer. but there does seem to be something about this all-male world. And I guess I grew up, I went to an all-boys school when I was young in Hull. So it's kind of, I kind of moved in, I've been in all-male environments, and they can be kind of pretty rough and pretty nasty. So I think that's what I drew upon. But yeah, so I think if you wanted to approach it through gender, that would be the only way I could think of doing it. My first novel was, I said, totally different, and it had sort of half and half in terms of the main characters. But this is it's an all-male environment.
Is the bear and its killing a vessel for rebirth, and if so, is this a self-conscious taking out of the question?
Actually, I should add to this. I mean, one of the discussions that we've had about naturalism and so on related to the other side of the question about the bear and animality and so on. And clearly, there's more than one dimension to the bear. So this is slightly a separate question from the last one.
Yeah. So I think are you particularly thinking of when he goes inside the bear? Which I was pissed off with the Revenant, who sort of came out at the same time.
We did discuss it.
Stole my idea. No, I think there have been other depictions of people taking shelter inside of dead animals. I think. Sorry, was the question about rebirth? Was it as? Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. Yes. I mean that. Where I got that idea from was I was in some of these books about whaling. It was presented as a tall tale that they told about the whale fishery, that one day someone got sort of separated from the boat and had to kill a polar bear and keep warm and to survive. And so it was offered as kind of, maybe it didn't happen, but this is a story people told. So as soon as I read that, I thought, I'll have that, I'll keep that, and I'll put it in the novel somewhere. I'll find some use for it. And I can't remember, maybe the whole idea of that kind of long polar bear hunt actually emerged from my sense of I need to get to this point where you can kill the bear and take refuge inside it. But yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think in terms of Sumner's story, it's a moment where he kind of disappears and is reborn, and then the scenes that follow, where he's with the missionaries. I think in the early what I was trying to do with that section of the novel is he doesn't, in some sense, he doesn't want to be reborn. I suppose that's what I was trying to get at. They pull him out of the dead bear and he comes back to life, but he doesn't want to be himself again. So he doesn't want to become the person he was, and he spends that interlude kind of refusing to, or partly refusing to become human. wanting to sort of stay something else, stay more animal, not to go back into this kind of set of expectations or histories that he's carried with him. So definitely, it's symbolically, that's a moment in which he kind of shrugs off his old identity, because of course they have no idea who he is, what his name is, why he's there. I mean, it's a great mystery. And then he kind of has to, I mean, he takes on his identity as a doctor, because he feels like he has to try and save the priest. So the way I was thinking of that is, he kind of resists it, he doesn't want to be human again, he doesn't want to go back to normal life, and then he's faced with this moral quandary that, does he let the priest die? No, he has to kind of take this moral stuff, and he kind of says, they have that exchange in which he says, I'm a surgeon now. So he adopts his a kind of identity, his identity as a doctor, as a surgeon, as someone who saves people's lives, as a kind of positive term of rebirth. The kind of Christian thing, I suppose, it was kind of too tempting not to use some of that, I suppose. And again, I'm interested in religious ideas. I don't practice any religion, but again, I suppose I'm a generation where I absorbed some of that biblical imagery and biblical stuff just through sort of growing up when I did. I think the bear is described as a tomb, like a tomb, or tomb-like in some sense. So I think I just felt like, it's some sense that he's kind of merging with this animal and coming out as a different thing. So I certainly wouldn't say there is no sense of kind of Christian mythology or Christian language and Christian iconography there. I think there probably is, but probably in the same way that there's Crane and Dreiser and Norris there, in the sense that it's just kind of in my unconscious to some extent. Is there another question about religion specifically? Okay, we'll save that for later. Yes.
So the follow-up question is specifically about Sumner saving the priest in that entire interview. What is the role of religion for the characters amidst the struggle for survival?
Yeah, I'm interested in religion, which is very unfashionable. I think so. So I think religion kind of crops up in all kinds of ways in the novel. And I think, for me, probably if I said, well, what's the most important passage in the novel, section of the novel, which is a funny question to ask, but I would say that it's the section with the priest. Because I think the priest, it's a novel which, as I said, it's a tough, cruel, kind of unforgiving world, but the closest we get to a moment of tenderness and a moment of forgiveness is the relationship between Sumner and the priest. The priest is obviously a kind of old 19th century missionary, so he has all these kind of backward, what we now think is very backward ideas about bringing the truth to the heathen, and they're very primitive and we need to civilize them and so on. So I definitely wasn't presenting him as a kind of wholly admirable character, but there are little moments which I think, for me, are really important, in which he kind of sympathizes with Sumner in the way that no one else does. He sort of says, you're too hard on yourself, or words to that effect, and you've suffered. We all suffer in that way. So there's that. If there's a kind of moral heart to the novel, it's that exchange, I think. And in some sense, it's a very brief. There's a very brief moment before he goes back to Hull, in which he's done the operation and the priest wakes up. There's just a page and a half, and I think it's the only kind of moment of tenderness in the novel, really. He kind of touches the priest's hand. So I think why did I give a priest? Why did I make a priest? Why did I give a priest that kind of power? Because these days priests don't always get a good press. I suppose because it seems to me, it's a novel. It is a novel which became, I didn't necessarily plan it, became about these kind of big questions about what it means to be human, good and evil. You know, is there any kind of basis for acting in a moral way? If there is, what can we find out? And it seems to me that if you start asking those questions, very quickly you get to a religious language, or you get to a sort of, not necessarily religious belief, but you get to the kind of, those seems to me the only people really asking those questions these days, or not, maybe that's not the right thing. They are religious questions in some sense. I mean, you could call them philosophical questions. I think they're really religious questions about what it means to be human, how finding ourselves in this position we're in, we decide to do one thing rather than the other. What makes certain actions acceptable or unacceptable, right or wrong? Those seem to me to be kind of religious questions. So I think that's why at this moment of kind of moral decision, I bring a priest into the action. I mean, there's also Otto, I think, if you remember Otto, who has this other much stranger set of religious beliefs. He's a Swedenborgian. But he's also kind of a prophet in the sense he actually does foresee what's going to happen. So I suppose I was just playing around with this sense of what explanatory system is better than the other. You know, because in some sense Otto's beliefs are ludicrous. You know, he thinks we all go into this place made of light. Everything turns into a rainbow. So in some sense that's ludicrous, but also I suppose I wanted to have some sense of maybe it's not that ludicrous. You know, to think in those kind of terms, there is something to it really. That maybe, and then what's the alternative? I suppose the alternative is someone like Drax, in which there's nothing, you don't believe in anything, you only believe in your own instincts. So I think religion comes in, you know, because Drax is a nihilist. Drax is a man who doesn't believe in any greater meanings at all, and that there's the exchange between him and Sumner is kind of the moment where you realise that, where he says, you know, something like the law is just a name for what certain kind of men prefer. So that's, I suppose that's what one of the things I'm doing is sort of saying, well, do you believe in Drax? If you don't believe in Drax, where else do you go for some kind of explanation, some kind of sense of how to make sense of where we are as human beings? And it seems to me that religion or religious language or religious ideas is maybe the best place to go, even if they're very flawed and incomplete. So in that sense I think that's probably the least fashionable part of the novel in some ways.
Yeah, my question is about the character of Drax, actually.
Okay.
Who's obviously a very dark character.
Yes.
But is he really that different from all the other characters in the way that a lot of the things that he does are to ensure his own survival? And isn't that ultimately what Sumner does as well? Would it make him a killer then as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Drax doesn't think he's different from anyone else. I mean, that's his point. He thinks everyone is like him, even though they pretend to be different. He thinks, you know, as I said, law is just one. You know, everyone follows their inclination. I think that's what he says at some point. I follow my inclination, you follow your inclination. But some people dress up their inclination in this kind of fancy language. So for Drax's point of view, everyone is the same, everyone is like him. But then Sumner in that exchange is kind of horrified by this possibility. But I suppose I wanted that to be a possibility in the novel. Because I think there is a kind of horrifying, I feel the horrifying possibility that maybe he's right, maybe we all just do follow our inclination and we like to dress it up in nicer ways. So I think that's a possibility in the novel. For me, it's a sort of scary possibility that everyone is like Drax on some level. That we think we do things for charitable or beneficent reasons, but maybe we're just doing what we like to do or getting what we want in a kind of more roundabout way. But I think ultimately no. I mean, ultimately the novel. I think the reason why the novel doesn't allow Drax to get away with that is because we see moments of kind of moral action and moral decision mainly from Sumner. I think that's one thing that the realist or naturalist novel does or relies on, is this idea of, we are determined by our circumstances and by our background and by our heredity, but do we have a free will to, at certain crucial moments, to choose the right thing rather than the wrong thing? So I think, for me, in the novel, that there are certain moments where Sumner does that, particularly to do with the priest, but also to do with pursuing Drax and wanting to find out who did the murder, and not allowing things just to take their course as they would have done if the captain had Brownlee had his way. So I think the fact that people are able to take moral action means that Drax's worldview doesn't win out. But then again, at the end, of course, Sumner gets pulled back into Baxter's world, pulled back into the world in the last sort of 30, 40 pages, and so he kills Drax, but then he kind of robs Baxter, doesn't he, and sort of dangles him, and so I think he's a morally complicated character. He's not straightforwardly heroic, but I think, I suppose I felt like that. In some sense, he wanted to escape, and Baxter sort of drew back into that world, and he was forced to kind of push back, and in order to escape, he had to do what he had to do. So I think the novel is interested in this idea that maybe everyone is like Drax, but I hope that my intention was to suggest that no, ultimately we're not, but only just maybe.
So do you think the degree of profanity in this novel is unprecedented for contemporary literary fiction? And did you imagine that it would attract a specific audience or restrict?
One of the reviews, always a line I liked, said if there was a Nobel Prize for swearing, then the North Water would win it. I don't know whether it's unprecedented, but I guess there is a lot of swearing in it. I mean, my logic for that is, of course, they're working class young men on their own, so I think it's entirely realistic. I think if you go into a sort of pub in Hull on a Saturday night, you'd probably hear worse. So it didn't seem to me an unrealistic way of imagining. I mean, dialogue is interesting because no one knows how a 19th century whaler actually spoke. There's no record of how they spoke. I think, in a way, even if I did know how they spoke, I wouldn't want to replicate it exactly in a 21st century novel. So dialogue is always very stylized. It's about creating a plausible, sort of lively version of how these people might speak. I guess once I got into the rhythm of it, I didn't notice it really. It was just a kind of this is how they talk. I mean, from a creative writing perspective, I think using swear words is a dangerous thing to do because they're kind of like using chili powder when you're making food. It's an instant sort of it gives something extra, but it's kind of cheap way of making the sentence or making the paragraph more powerful if you're not careful about it. But you can throw it in as a kind of cheap effect. So I hope I didn't do that. But once I was writing, it's just, well, they're those kind of men. That's how they speak. It's just kind of almost like a punctuation mark that they use. I don't think I thought about. Well, actually, I think there's a point. I mean, in terms of whether people would be put off by it or not. I mean, that goes to the larger question of audience and how much you worry or think about the audience and how they will react. I mean, some writers, when you say, do you worry about your audience, they'll say, I don't care about my audience, I just write about stuff that I like and hope that someone else will like it. I'm not quite like that. I mean, I do think a bit about audience and wonder about what people are going to be interested in, not interested in. But then at the same time, you get to a certain point in the novel where you kind of stop caring, in the sense that you're committed to this project, you're committed to writing it in this way, you have to see it through, you hope people will like it. If they don't, there's not much you can do about it. I mean, I'm sure there are people who find the swearing, I know there are people who find the violence unpleasant and off-putting. So there probably are people who find the language too much to stomach as well, but can't please all the people all the time.
I have two questions which have been attributed to me, but the creative writing questions, so I doubt this, but if you're happy to answer them.
Yes.
One was, the first one is that we were interested to know whether you had conceived the novel in a linear fashion.
Right.
Because clearly at the centre of the novel is this interlude and flashback with Sumner, which is so powerful. We wondered whether you had started with that as part of your narrative and then built the rest around it.
No, I didn't start with that, although it is chronologically the first thing. I mean, I think, as far as I remember, I wrote the novel more or less in the order it appears. I definitely wrote chapter 1 first. I remember doing that. But I knew that I needed to have Sumner's have a backstory which was important in the novel. So it was a question of when on how I could get that in. That is technically it's a difficult thing to do that. I think that's one of the hardest things to do, is to tell a story in which what's happened to a character in the past is really important, and to find a way of working that in which isn't too jolting. And then I did it through a kind of dream, which I don't know. I was kind of in two minds about that, but then I suppose my hope was, okay, the reader will swallow it, and then once you get into the scene, they'll forget about how you got there and it will work. I guess I remember at the beginning of the novel I had Drax fairly early. I knew, because it was my first idea, psychopathic murderer on a whaling ship. Okay, so it starts with a murderer, and I had a kind of strong sense of who he was, but then I knew I needed someone to counterbalance Drax, and I knew fairly early on that he would be the ship's surgeon. I only realised I didn't really read many naval books before I wrote this one, but I realised that it's kind of a convention almost that the ship's surgeon is an important character. You know, like on Star Trek, if you remember Star Trek, Bones, because they're always slightly out. They're not part of the mainstream. They're a slightly different character, so they often are a different viewpoint. So it was clear that the person to have opposing Drax was the ship's surgeon. So then I did sort of research into who would be a ship's surgeon on a whaling ship. Why would you do a job like that? And I discovered it wasn't a great job to have if you're a surgeon. So the only reason you would go on to the whaling ship is if, as I said, Arthur Conan Doyle did it when he was a student. So there has to be something's gone slightly wrong with this character's life for him to be a surgeon on a whaling ship. So then the question, what's gone wrong? And also I knew that I wanted him to have some kind of interesting story to make him work as a character. And then I think I can't remember exactly how it happened, but it was like, oh, maybe what could have been involved in? Could have been some personal tragedy? Could he have done something, killed someone, done something that he's ashamed of? Been in jail or something, all these kind of possibilities floating around. And then I think, for some reason I thought, well, maybe he's been in the army, what could he have been involved in? And then that's where the Indian idea came from. So I think I had, when I started the novel, I knew that he had this history of India and the mutiny, and something has happened to him in India. And I was just waiting for an opportunity to sort of put that in. And then when he gets kind of frozen, that seemed like a moment to put it in. And I think the way I work is I do plan things. I try and plan things out quite carefully. But I also know that once you start writing, all the plans change. So you have this slightly kind of a strange sort of dualistic things going on in your mind. On one hand, okay, this is my plan. I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. But you know that actually that's not going to happen. But you have to believe, on some level you believe it is going to happen, even though you know it's not going to happen. That's how you kind of proceed. So I think I can't remember to what extent I actually planned for that episode to occur there. it may be that I planned for it to kind of be spread out a little bit more. You know, he would remember little bits here and there, and then it just seemed to me the opportunity to sort of just get it all out at that one time came then.
This is not my question either, it's another one about practice. The biggest temporal jump is when Sumner leaves the priest's cabin and goes back to Hull.
Yeah.
If not the biggest narrative jump, because it's inevitable in some respects. But it made us think, are there, and you prompted us as well today in your comments, are there certain things in the editing that you left out that were precious that you could see going back in? And not necessarily the ending, but other episodes.
Yeah, I mean you cut a lot out. Yeah, I mean that's the process is writing, cutting. So I don't know. When I write, I think I like other writers do this. I know I have this other. I write on the computer, and then I have another folder in which every now and then I take stuff which I realise I don't want, and I put it in the other folder. I can't remember how big the other how many words the other folder had in by the time I got to I would probably at least 50,000 words of stuff that you've written and then cut out. So 50%. Yeah, in terms of the ending was the most dramatic thing, but the ending did have nice things. Like I suppose if there's one thing I regret about the ending, it's that the ring. If you remember the ring came back in the original ending. There was a nice way of sort of tying it off. So he has this ring which comes in early on, and I think I always thought that would come back, and that in the first ending, that's how Drax has ended up with the ring, and back in Hull, there's a prostitute who Baxter sends to Drax and then sends to Sumner, and she has the ring. And so that's in the first novel, first ending, how Sumner realizes that Drax is still alive and is in Hull. He recognizes that this woman is wearing the ring, and she thinks it's paste. She thinks it's not worth anything. And he sees the ring and sort of says, "Where did you get that from?" And that's how he realizes that Drax is alive. So I quite like that idea. So that was kind of a sacrifice. And I think there is a bit of the ring is kind of dangling, really. It's sort of there, but it is a kind of slightly loose end.
Okay, now that we're on to creative writing questions, especially, I'd like, if it's okay, to joke it out. Bear in mind, I don't know everybody's name here, so I apologise if I just call you. So you.
I would like to ask a question that actually you answered now, but I would like to know a little bit more about the writing process.
Yes.
So you had a plan before you wrote the book. You had the structure, the topics, characters, and so you prepared everything before you wrote it, or you just let yourself go? And the plan that you had, how did you manage to the changes?
I mean, I think talking to writers, I think there's a big spectrum of planning and not planning. And there's some, on one end of the spectrum, people I know them, they don't plan at all. They just sit down and type and somehow get to the end of the first draft, and you end up with a very, very rough first draft that you have to go over and again and again and again. And then the other extreme, it's chapter by chapter, maybe note cards and all this. I suppose I'm in the middle. I'm somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, in that I do like to have a plan, and I'll have a fairly detailed plan of the chapter I'm working on, and the next chapter, and maybe the chapter after that. Then after that, it becomes quite blurry, and I'll just have a sense of a kind of the narrative arc, and where I want to get towards the end. But I change it all the time. I mean, I'm working on a new novel now, and I have a big pile of plans. I look back on them and that was a ridiculous idea. Why did I think that was going to happen? And that character's not like that at all. I suppose one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from, well, it was kind of overhearing it from Martin Amis, who taught at Manchester briefly, and he said to writer that thinking and reading and thinking is work too. Because sometimes you think you're only really working when you're writing, which is a tempting thing. But I think thinking and just sort of staring into space and pondering is really important. It can actually save you a lot of time. So I spend quite a lot of time thinking, and I sort of say, okay, well, if this is going to happen, if this happens, or reach this point in a plot, what's going to happen next? Which is always a big question. I think, what's going to happen next? Well, and usually there are several options. So sometimes I'll write, okay, this could happen, that could happen, that could happen, that could happen, A, B, C, D. And if A happens, then that has this consequence, and B happens that. But then putting it all down on paper, it often becomes very clear which is the thing that should happen. You say, okay, that just doesn't feel right, or that's ludicrous, or if he's not the right character to do, sort of thing. So I suppose I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think there's for me there's an ongoing process of trying to plan as much as you can, and then once you sit down to actually write it, realizing that some of that plan will work and some of it won't. And I think the big thing is when you sit down to write, you get different ideas, you get new ideas that pop up that you have to go with if they're better ideas. It's a slightly uncomfortable process. I mean, I think I would like to be some person who could plan it all out in advance. I sort of fantasize that if I could do that, everything's going to happen, then you just write it. But because for me, the difficult thing is knowing the plot, I suppose, and knowing what happens next and making sure that happens. But and not knowing that is uncomfortable. But I think that's the uncomfortableness of writing in some way.
Yeah, what's your sort of top tips for making interesting, relatable, likeable characters?
I'm not sure if they have to be likeable.
but engaging them.
I suppose my top tip would be they have to be active characters. I think a lot of students, because people who want to be writers are often quite introverted. And quite they like spending lots of time on their own, because you have to spend a lot of time on your own to be a writer. They often create characters who are quite introverted and sort of passive, and that, I mean, you can get away with that, but you have to be awfully good to get away with a central character who's passive and quiet. Well, quiet is not the right word, but kind of is not proactive about things. So I think that would be something. Just your characters have to do things, have to make things happen, even if they're forced to make things happen. I mean, Sumner is a character who doesn't want to do things. He wants to retreat with his laudanum and his Homer, but by circumstances he's forced to act. So I think that if I had a top tip, it might be that: avoid passive characters. Find some way of making them do stuff.
Oh, cool. You've spoken quite a lot about where the book is situated among literary authors, both people who write about the 19th century and people who wrote in the 19th century. So Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian, I think Drax is quite similar in some ways to the Judge in Blood Meridian as far as being an agent of chaos. And when you were, and Joseph Conrad and so on, Melville. So when you were writing the book and trying to construct it as a narrative unto itself, did you find yourself purposefully or otherwise thinking about where this book fits among those authors in terms of what it's saying about humanity and our capacity for evil and so forth?
Not in a very kind of clear-headed way. I think that would be that would freeze you up too much, to worry too much. I think there's one thing I've discovered with the North Water, which I didn't realise with my first novel, because my first novel didn't get very much attention, so no one interviewed me or asked me much about it. But with the North Water, because it's got more attention, I've been interviewed, and I realised once you finish the book, you have to create a second story about the book that you can tell people, which is kind of plausible and interesting and true as you can make it. So I think it's at that stage where you start thinking about those questions about, you know, how similar or different, you know, is this like Moby Dick or different? And it was only after I'd written it, people started asking me those questions that I came up with an opinion about that, really. So when you're writing, I mean, when I'm writing, I think it's mainly about, it's very pragmatic. It's about, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to make it interesting? And you're just using all the material you've got at hand. You're pulling on all your resources, whether it's stuff you've read, your imagination, anything you can to make this sort of fly. And then it's only after it's done, and hopefully, you know, if you're lucky enough to get it published and people read it, that you begin to sort of think, okay, what does it mean? What does it not mean? Because when you're writing, it's all about just creating some kind of object which works in itself, I think.
Of course.
So, what inspired you to write this novel?
Well, I think it was, again, sort of pragmatic reasons, as I've said. I mean, I suppose why I guess you could say why write any novel, which is a good question, which is both a fascinating question and an impossible question to answer. I think why write a novel rather than do something else? I mean, I think the reason that is something I do sort of think about these kind of big philosophical questions, and I come up with different reasons for doing that. I think writing novels, like any work of art, is kind of a way of making sense of the world and a way of creating some kind of shape and structure. So I think that's the basic answer to that, is kind of, you know, you want to, I think any work of art is a way of taking what may be kind of confusing or chaotic or uncertain experience and shaping it so it seems to have a kind of meaning. So that, I think that's the deeper question. But I think all people, a writer's motivations is very complicated, and that makes it seem rather high blown that you want to create this great work of art. You also have these kind of much more mundane and less impressive reasons that you like to, you know, you want to be successful and you like people to read the book, etc., etc. You have these kind of rather grubby motivations as well. So it's probably a mixture of the two.
I'd just add to that, though, you know, one motivation presumably the creative writers don't have is the one that's similar to that of academics. Academics are forced to produce more and more. In the old days, you used to have academics who would ruminate for many years and then produce a masterpiece. That's never going to work for creative writers, is it?
Well, I think
the former rather than the latter.
Yes, yeah, no, I think it varies in terms of genre, what genre you're writing, because I'm fortunate enough that the North Water is it's a literary fiction, so editors and publishers, if you're writing literary fiction, they'll give you more or less as long as you want. Although they still say they want a novel every 3 years. That's kind of their. If you say it's going to be more than 3 years, they don't like it that much. But if you're writing thrillers or crime novels, they want a novel every year. And people I know who write that's just the routine. If you can't deliver, they're not going to stick with you because that's what the readership expects as well. You know, they read them quickly and you want the next one. So it's very much to do with genre, I think.
If people don't mind, I have an associated question with that, but it's to do with the industry and the profession, and it's and also to do with the composition of this novel. Is there a way in which, by making the engine a little bit more closed, at the behest of the editors, and particularly with the television adaptation coming up soon, have you left yourself open to be pressurized to produce a series character, you know, North Water 2?
Yeah. I don't think, well, people have asked me that question, and so I definitely wouldn't have wanted to write. I mean, if I wrote another novel, which I don't think I will, I can't imagine doing, I think it would be a prequel about Drax and what he was before, because that's something that novel doesn't touch on at all, and I can imagine maybe finding that interesting. It's funny, but the original version was more, although it was more open, there was more possibility of Sumner continue as a character, but I don't know. No, I mean that hasn't been part of it. I haven't had much discussion about the TV. I mean, but the TV, it hasn't been part of the discussion that they wanted to continue. Although I suppose that depends on how successful or unsuccessful it is. And I suppose if it is successful, there might be some pressure of sort of figuring out some way of squeezing another series out of it, which it doesn't always end well.
So because while you were talking, you brought up a lot of issues like religion and the difference between human and animal and everything. And I was wondering what came first in your process, if you had like the will to talk about those issues, and then you build the story around them, or the other way around, like while you were building the narrative, like those things came to you?
Yes, the second, definitely. I'm very wary of ideas in fiction. I think ideas are dangerous things for fiction writers. I mean, who knows? But I don't think it's a good idea to start off trying to write a novel based on an abstract idea. But I do think if you have a strong plot, an interesting set of characters, those ideas will emerge from them, as long as you're open to the ideas. So my approach is very much you start with the story, you start with the characters, and then there will be opportunities to say things about these bigger issues. And you just need to be alert to those opportunities and say those things when they come about. And then as you write the novel, you begin to sort of say, oh, that idea is coming up again. That idea is, or that symbol or that image is coming up again. That must be what I'm interested in. That must be what this novel is exploring about. So I think, yeah, for me, you start with the kind of basics, and then you just stay alert to these bigger ideas, and you build on them. But I think the danger of doing the other way around is it becomes a bit lifeless. It becomes a bit too theoretical. So yeah, that's a good question, I think.
I mean, just to add to that, while there's an interactive, the thing that we discuss frequently is a class in literature in terms of ideas. And I don't know how much you were aware of this, but it keeps coming back to capitalism. And particularly the paraphernalia of capitalism to do with pitting individuals against one another. Was that consciously an issue? I mean, clearly Baxter is a capitalist, but was it something that you were aware of as recurring amongst characters?
Yeah, I think it comes for me. It comes from the character. I mean, Baxter, yes. Okay, I know I want someone who's going to be owner of the whale ship, and not only owner of a whale ship, prepared to sink it for the insurance money. So he's going to be a certain kind of character who's driven by money and doesn't particularly care about the consequences of that. So he's driven by greed, and then that opens up that whole set of issues. But at the same time, whaling was an industry, and it was a very and I set it at the end of the whaling era because I wanted to have a sense of what that meant, which was they'd killed so many whales that it was no longer economic to send boats to Greenland to kill even more. So there was there is a sense of the despoliation of the environment and of the kind of greed which goes along with that, and the sense, of course, that Baxter is becomes kind of almost like a mythic capitalist in the sense that he's whaling is finished, so he's on to the next thing. He's on to paraffin and oil by the end of the novel. So he just follows the money, and he says that early on, doesn't he? He said, we follow the money. We had a good time while it lasted, but the money will go where it wants to go. I think that's it. And of course, it fits in with the Indian section because, of course, colonialism is driven by mercantilism. It was only after the Indian Mutiny, the late 1850s, that the British government actually took over India. Before then, it was the East India Company that was running India. So purely for kind of mercantile reasons. So it's, in some sense, it's absolutely there, but I think it's there because that's what was going on. I think if you're going to write about whaling, and I think Melville does that to some degree in Moby Dick, that it is about a kind of capitalist industrial system.
We were talking earlier about the difference of writing for stage and writing a novel and TV, and I'm really curious. Obviously, it's fantastic that North Water is going to be adapted by the BBC, but I understand that an adapter will be brought in, so you won't have anything to do with that. Is there a kind of line, line in the sand in your head where you're thinking they're not going to do this to it? Or contractually, have you got no control over that whatsoever? Because as I say, when I write for the stage, I may not be paid as handsomely as I hope a BBC adaptation is, but I know full well that 99% of my words are going to be up there.
Yeah, actually, I don't know about. I'd have to look at the contract. I mean,
or your agent.
Because I think in practical terms, I don't think I'd have very little control. I think the people with the money have the most control. I mean, Andrew Haig is the writer-director. He's in charge. It's his baby, really. I think I haven't thought about it that much because I like his work so much, the work I've seen, and I feel like he's going to do a really interesting job with it. He's not going to twist it or make anything too strange with it. But then I think it will inevitably be an odd thing to see it reimagined, and I think it will be an odd thing to see actors saying these words, because however good they are, they're not going to say them in exactly the same way. And I sort of have an image in my mind of what they look like and what they are like, and inevitably the actors are not going to look like that. So it's going to be a strange experience. I mean, on the other hand, they never said, "Would you like to write it?" And they never said, "Would you like to be involved in writing it?" That was never on the table. But I never sort of said I wanted to, because I think mainly because for me it's finished, and I'm working on a different project now. So it would be funny to go back to it and try and sort of reinvent it and write it again. So for me, there's a kind of, once you've finished it, there is a kind of relief. Okay, I've done it. I hope it's good, but for all its flaws, it's out there, and it's a finished thing now. So I'm happy for someone else to take it on and make what they will of it. Yeah. But it's going to be a very odd thing. I was saying to Paul, because you're writing a novel, it's just you and your laptop. It's pretty low tech. I wrote the first novel on pen and paper, and then suddenly now there's this kind of massive infrastructure to turn it into a TV thing, because it's going to be so complicated, to make it into a TV series. It feels very odd that it's now become just part of this enormous thing which I have no control over. But I guess that's the way it goes.
We have time to squeeze in about one more question, and if we can do one about adaptation, it'd be good, because we're quite concerned with adaptation. Anything more on top of this?
Well, I could say something broadly about adaptation. I mean, I think I suppose it's, a lot of people have said about the novel, it's very cinematic. I mean, I think that's a lot of the comments I've had just as readers and things like that. Oh, it's visual and cinematic, which is, I think that makes sense, because it's about the landscape. And one of the great sort of gifts of writing about the Arctic is you have the landscape. It's like, it's there, and all you can just describe it, and it's this beautiful thing that you can use. Whereas the novel I'm writing now is set in a city, and it's like, oh, I don't have that landscape anymore. I can't use that. So there are lots of moments in the novel in which I just kind of use the landscape and you use this kind of create this panoramic view. I think also I probably have fairly kind of visual imagination, so I conceive things in pictures. So I can, when I'm writing a scene, I do have a pretty clear picture of it in my mind. There is a kind of forward momentum to it, yeah. Which again, I'm glad that came through. But yeah, a lot of people have said that to me, that you kind of keep on going to the end, and I think that is a risk. I suppose the other side is the other flip is binge watching. So maybe I don't know how they. I don't know how they decide that, because sometimes they do release the whole series at one go, don't they? So maybe they'll do that. Maybe that would be the way of doing it, rather than week by week. Because I think you're right. I think it would be better to watch it the whole 6 hours.
Okay, on that bombshell of binging, I have just one intervention. Finally.
Can you tell us anything about the book you're writing now?
Yes, it's another historical novel. It's set in Manchester in the 1867. It's about early form of Irish terrorism. Although terrorism isn't. So there's a group called the Fenian Brotherhood, who were early Irish nationalists. So it's about that. It starts with a hanging. So it starts with an actual event, which was the hanging of 3 Fenians for the murder of a policeman in Manchester in 1867, and then it imagines various consequences of that act. And their central character is an Irish detective who was seconded, taken from Ireland to Manchester to investigate the Fenians. So it's similar in some ways, in the sense it's kind of it's not sort of dark historical literary thriller, but it's very different in other ways as well. I don't know how it's going to end yet.
That brings me a question. How do you pass from actual facts to fiction without losing the sense of reality?
Well, with the North Water, I suppose there are different kinds of historical novels. I realised that. I mean, there are certain historical novels like Hilary Mantel or something like that, which is definitely it's about sort of bringing to life actual events and historical events. Whereas the North Water is, the context is accurate, but the actual events and all the people are made up. Whereas the novel I'm writing on now is a little bit halfway between, in the sense that it starts off with an actual event, and a couple of the people in the novel are based on actual people, although we don't know anything about them, they're not famous. But it raises a different set of questions, I think, about how accurate, close you need to be. For me, that's the question it raises: how far can I diverge from actual facts? What does it mean to diverge from actual facts? I think I prefer to make stuff up than to be too tied by the historical record. So I think the things that happen in this novel could have happened. It wouldn't be completely implausible. But at the same time, they're much more kind of exciting and interesting than stuff that actually did happen.
Okay. So, one last chance.
Actually, I have another one.
Good, I like that.
When I read the thriller, for me the most interesting part of the book is the villain. How do you build the villain to make it interesting and not over the top, but still?
Well, it was hard. I mean, Drax was easy once I sort of got the sense of him being an animal. So that was a kind of gift. But I can't do that again. So actually, one of the problems with starting the new novel is there's not a villain in the same way, but there is a character who is a kind of villainous character. And it did take me. I think this is normal. You kind of have to shrug off the previous book, shrug off the previous idea. So it took me a while to sort of figure, okay, he's not like Drax. He's not psychopathic. He has something else that motivates him. And it's a different set of motivations. So I suppose it's a sort of obvious but important thing. I mean, what why do they do what they do, what motivates them. And I think it's often, for me, it's very good if you can boil a character down into a sentence or two. Because when you're writing, you often kind of lose track of a character sometimes. Oh, they're doing this thing, they're doing that thing. Oh, who are they? Why are they doing this? And then you think, okay, I remember, this is what motivates them. This is the core of their character. And you can kind of go back and that helps you navigate. So I think, yeah, I mean, think about what motivates them and think about maybe boiling that down to just a sentence or two, which can then help you as he or she has different sort of contexts. Yeah.
And we weren't going to discuss other novels, but seeing as you've mentioned the future one, I'd just say to round this off, if you've enjoyed The North Water, it's very different, but do try Incredible Bodies. I can vouch for some of the reality that's depicted in that. It's set on a university campus. Okay, so I'd like to thank, first of all, Ian, and to thank my ENG 2005 students, and for you also for keeping the conversation going and interesting. Many thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul, for organising it.
Yes, thank you to Paul. Thanks for the really interesting questions. I enjoyed it very much.